Gareth Jenkins at the UK Post Office inquiry. Well, this is a tough one. Jerk or genius? I don't think either. I think something else was revealed during the 4 days he was in front of the inquiry. And I wonder if we're going to be a bit more divided in our response to Mr. Jenkins. Some folk think he acted like a right turnip. Others thought what he did was quite reasonable. Well, mostly. And the division seems to be less about Mr. Jenkins and more about the Horizon system. Hey, Horizon is no worse than any other computer system. It was robust because only a tiny fraction of what it did was wrong. My view is that it was a system that had very poor security protocols and inadequate systems of auditing and reporting errors, but I'm not an IT expert, so I don't really know. But we've been also reminded a few times that we're missing the point on this, and that Horizon wasn't the problem. It was the people who were the problem, specifically those working at Post Office Limited and Fujitsu, and in government, and in some of the legal agencies too. So let's go back to focus for a moment on Mr. Jenkins. Now, before I do, I have to explain something. The computer I use to edit my videos has died. I mean, completely died. And the irony of that happening as I'm trying to do a video on the Horizon IT system failing doesn't escape me. But it means that I'm having to do all of the editing on a very old laptop, and I'm quite restricted in what I can do. And I'm a bit restricted in time because something weird is happening at work. So sorry about that, but you've just got my big fat face on screen for the entirety, but I hope you can stick with me in spite of all of that. So, on to Mr. Jenkins and my mixed feelings about his performance at the inquiry. I felt angry and sympathetic. I wasn't feeling sympathetic when I saw the evidence of him referring to sub-postmasters as thieves and that they were jumping on the bandwagon. And when they were complaining about Horizon, all of that was really distasteful. And he did seem to be someone who was blindly following the crowd and not exercising his own moral judgment. Also, his apparent nonchalant approach to Seema Misra, whose his actions helped to wrongly imprison, he didn't seem to think about the gravity of what he was doing at the time, and I didn't sense he understood the weight of responsibility he had on his shoulders. When he was being a witness in court. I think he does now understand it. But his claimed ignorance at the time was for me really hard to swallow. To not pay much attention to instructions coming from a barrister about your obligations to the court seemed odd. I've been in that situation of being a witness in a court case. I listened very carefully to the instructions I was given by a barrister. I don't understand why he apparently didn't. Was he wicked? Was he stupid? His explanation was that he was neither, and that he was just doing his job. But that was, as we all know, the excuse the Nazis made. But in those moments, when I felt angry about his behaviour, the anger didn't stick because something else kicked in. And I think it was that thing that made us all so angry about the post office scandal in the first place. We don't like to see the little guy getting trampled on. That's deep in the UK psyche, and that might have been the thing that softened my response to Mr. Jenkins, because at times he seemed to be one of the little guys who'd been trampled on, and for big chunks of his testimony, he seemed terrified. But then again, he was also at times the one trampling on the little guy, and then I'm back to being angry about him all over again. Now, I don't know what the public's response to Mr. Jenkins has been, because I live in Australia. I moved here from the UK in 2012, and being so far away, I can't get a read on the public response. But I'm thinking the public may be less inclined to put Gareth's head on a spike, as they have with the likes of Van der Bogard, Venables, Perkins, and poor little old George. So I think my view of Jenkins' performance seemed to oscillate between seeing him as a dirty wizard to an absent-minded professor. And to me, he cast quite a lonely figure most of the time. He was there for 4 days, 4 full days. Paula Venables was only there for 3. And his appearance also had that long build-up. His name was plastered all over the scandal from the very early on. And he was, I think, the first one to become a person of interest to the police. And he demanded immunity from prosecution over any testimony he gave to the inquiry before he would agree to appear before the inquiry, which was refused. And that kind of all added to the drama. So I think there was a lot going on in my head when I was watching him. And that's probably why I found it all confusing. But then things started to become a little clearer. Actually, 3 things started to become clearer. And I don't mean to make this a long video, so I'll whiz through those 3 things as fast as I can without breaking anything. Mark Zuckerberg pushed forward the motto "Move fast and break things" to define the organizational culture of Facebook after its formal founding in 2004, and the motto soon became a mantra for the tech industry in Silicon Valley, but also moved out into other sectors during that decade. The "Move fast and break things" started off as a means to promote an entrepreneurial spirit that prized innovation through detaching it from traditional governance structures like risk assessment and control, from quality assurance processes, and from lines of accountability. The mantra basically told us to try out new stuff, don't worry that it might cause harm, because if it does, well, just dump it, move on, try something else. Effectively, they were outsourcing the testing and error reporting and risk management of their products to consumers who would take on that role unknowingly and do so unpaid. But the problem was that detaching those governance structures meant that it wasn't things that were getting broken, it was people who were getting broken, and that made investors twitchy, which is probably why Facebook in 2014 replaced it with "move fast with stable infrastructure," which hasn't really caught on in the same way. But it was too late. By then the "move fast and break things" mantra had bedded in deep into organizational cultures in the corporate sector, and it went undercover, particularly in the tech industry. And I think it remains there today. And it remains, I think, because the mantra gets product to market quicker, which gives a quick return on investment, and they can, with certain classes of product, placate public concern through issuing firmware updates over the internet to fix the crap tech that they've just sold us, and they get to collect product test data through the telemetry that the product sends back over the internet in return. I think this happened in Microsoft with Windows. They used to have a whole army of Windows product testers that worked at Microsoft, but I think it was around 2014, just as the "move fast and break things" mantra was supposed to have been abandoned by Facebook. Well, Microsoft sacked all their Windows testers, and now they pretty much just release their software in beta to the public and collect data on faults from the telemetry it collects on users. Now, I might have oversimplified things. I don't know. I'm not a tech geek. But that seems to be kind of what might have happened. And I think that's the sort of thing that's happening quite a lot in the tech industry. So we might get a glimpse of that, of the consequence of all that in how people are responding to Jenkins' testimony. What he was describing as happening 10 years ago was pretty common back then in tech. It's still common today, to the point it seems normal and even reasonable that this sort of tech product will ship with faults, and perhaps that's why we aren't as angry, or maybe is why we're so divided over this thing about faults with a horizon. Okay, point 2. This is a thing that the philosopher Zygmunt Bauman has written about. It's the process by which someone's moral judgment becomes a technical judgment. So if you build a bomb, you're doing a technically good job if the bomb explodes as it's been designed to do, but you've not done a morally good job if it's used to kill innocent people. And Jenkins was telling us he had done a technically good job, but he had little to say about the morality of what he'd done. He was defending his actions by telling us he didn't engage in wrongdoing because he helped design a computer system that did what it was supposed to do most of the time. Then the problem is that he didn't ask if the times it didn't do what it was supposed to do resulted in people being harmed. I see this all the time when I teach my psychology students, and I hear it all of the time from other colleagues teaching students from other disciplines. I just can't remember the last time a student asked me for guidance on how to produce a piece of work that would do no public harm, or even better, might do some public good, to produce work that might improve people's lives. Instead, the questions my students ask are mostly technical ones, like how many words should I write? How should the text be formatted? Should I use subheadings? How many references should I cite? And my worry is that we seem to be teaching our students to ask technical questions, not moral questions. And that might be because we're mostly measuring our students' success in terms of their ability to be technically proficient, to follow instructions rather than to be good moral agents who can make good ethical judgments. I might be wrong, but it's just what I see. And it's been the case for the past 30 or more years that I've been teaching at university. Actually, I think it's been a problem for a very long time, and Jenkins might be a product of that problem. Now, my third point, final point, we're almost there. There appears to be an assumption that technology is morally and politically neutral, and that might have informed our reaction to Jenkins' testimony. But it might also be a thing that sits at the heart of the Horizon scandal, sits there in what appears to be a reasonable point being made by Jason Beer, by some of the witnesses, but also by the public, which is along the lines of Horizon was not at fault. It was how people used Horizon that was at fault. The computer system wasn't to blame. And it's because the computer system becomes characterized as this inert, morally neutral object. It's like the argument that guns don't kill people, people kill people. Well, that's wrong, because it sidesteps the important bit, which is that guns are designed by people to kill people. Except here in Australia, also to kill feral pigs and maybe the odd crocodile. Anyway, back to the point. Technology is designed with a moral purpose, and a computer code has a moral code embedded in it. A computer does what it does because someone has decided that it's important that it does what it does. And it does that thing because someone thinks that thing is more important to do than that other thing. And that's how computer code becomes imprinted with our values. Facial recognition is a really good example of this, the software for facial recognition. This was software that started to be developed in the 1960s. And it's recently got to such a level of refinement that it's been used in a wide variety of industries and public bodies, chief among them security industries and law enforcement agencies. The problem is that the software was developed largely by academics working in prestigious universities like Stanford in the US, which is where some of the major early work began. And it continues to happen in such universities, but it's also being taken up by the tech industry, particularly in Silicon Valley. And it's gone through a lot of testing. This was well before that move to, move fast and break things. Before all of that came in. So they were testing and testing and testing. They did a lot of testing so that they could get it technically good, good enough to work reliably, or maybe I should say robustly. And that's important when it's tech that's going to be used by law enforcement. And they thought they got it right, to the point that they handed it over to law enforcement. And they thought it worked pretty well. But the problem is that throughout the testing, they tested it on students at those prestigious universities because you don't have to pay them, or on co-workers in the tech industry because you don't have to pay them extra. And there was the problem. Those people were pretty much all white people. Most people at prestigious universities have historically been white, and most tech workers have historically been white. And it turns out the software can now do a reasonable job of detecting white faces, but it's damned awful at detecting black ones because it hasn't been properly tested on black people. And with that facial recognition software being used by the police, that's pretty consequential. Those errors are pretty consequential. We've got lots of cases, a lot of them in the US, of black people being wrongfully arrested because the facial recognition software has mistaken them as someone else. This is also quite close to home in terms of my work in academia. The problem started to get noticed during COVID when universities started shifting exams to online exams, and they used facial recognition software to check that students were there and they weren't cheating, because we're obsessed with cheating. And, they needed to check that someone else wasn't doing the exam in the student's place. And it turns out we had a lot of black students either being recorded as absent or as having someone else taking the exam for them because the software couldn't properly recognize black faces. The software had racism encoded into it by the programmers as a consequence of the characteristics of the people who had coded it and the people it was tested on. And it reminds us that when a programmer writes code, they're making decisions as to what things are important for the computer to do and what things aren't, and what things need to be tested and how they need to be tested. And those are decisions based on a whole set of assumptions and values, and ultimately they're moral choices. And I think Jenkins was blindsided by that because he didn't understand that he was actually writing moral code, not just computer code. Okay, let's wrap up, and I'll give you some conclusions and we can finish. So maybe we can further understand the post office scandal by considering the damage done to us by the legacy of the move fast and break things approach to technology, but also by how people may have lost focus on the moral consequences of what they're doing because they're being taught to primarily focus on being technically proficient. And maybe we've all become deluded into thinking that computer systems can't be morally bad because, well, they can. And maybe it's time to recognize that computers aren't neutral. They're imprinted with our moral codes, which means a computer system might be robust but can also be immoral because when we code a computer, we're embedding into that code all of our human frailties, all of our human irrationalities, all of our priorities and our prejudices, and that when that's embedded into computer code, all of that can become camouflaged as bugs, errors, and defects, as, just technical quirks. But the harm those things can do, even if those technical quirks are few and far between, can get amplified, and worse, can be really hard to trace. And my question is, does all of this help us to understand what happened with Horizon? Fujitsu did have the system in testing, but it looks like it came out of testing and then got released to market prematurely, with a whole load of bugs, errors, and defects that they knew about. And they didn't have a proper system in place for locating and logging the errors or for warning the end user about the harm those errors could do. And that became a major issue because they released it maybe before it was ready to be released, and they released it into thousands of post office branches, which were all being controlled by Post Office Limited, which turns out to be an organization that not only had a toxic culture where people in those branches were blamed for everything that went wrong in those branches, even if it couldn't be proven to be their fault, but Post Office Limited also had a perverted and insatiable appetite for taking out prosecutions against those people when they questioned or complained. And when that became apparent to Fujitsu, as it surely did early on, well, it looks like they turned a blind eye. Okay, that was a long one. Sort of long. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you like this video, please click the thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed, maybe click subscribe. And do leave comments. I'll respond to them as soon as I can, as many of them as I can, as soon as I can. All of that sort of, the thumbs up, the subscribing, and the comments, they're just things that help make the video more visible to the public. I don't monetize any of my videos, never have, never will. And I'm only doing this because I want to try and add something helpful to the public discourse. And it's just kind of up to you, really, to decide whether that's what I've done. Okay. That's all for now. Thanks. Ta-da.